If you've ever watched someone lie to your face while you held all the evidence they didn't know existed, hit that subscribe button. Subscribe if you believe that killers who think they're smarter than forensic psychologists eventually reveal themselves through the smallest unconscious tells, because what I'm about to tell you proves that sometimes catching a murderer isn't about dramatic confessions. It's about understanding that the human brain can't fully control its responses to specific triggers. My name is Evelyn Trent. I'm 37 years old, and I'm a forensic psychologist who specializes in criminal interviews and behavioral analysis. And the day I used a simple cup of coffee to expose a killer who'd evaded justice for 3 years was the day I finally understood that revenge doesn't require confrontation. It requires patience and precision. But before I tell you about that interview room and the involuntary flinch that destroyed a perfect facade, let me take you back to where professional duty became personal mission, because every story of methodical justice starts with someone you care about being taken from you in ways that demand accountability. I'd been working as a forensic psychologist for the district attorney's office for 6 years when my younger sister Iris was murdered. She was 28 years old, an elementary school teacher who volunteered at homeless shelters on weekends and collected stray cats like other people collected art. Iris was pure kindness wrapped in a tiny 5'2" frame, the kind of person who saw good in everyone even when evidence suggested otherwise. She was found in her apartment on a Tuesday morning when she didn't show up for work. Her colleague went to check on her and discovered her body in the living room. She'd been strangled, then staged to look like she was sleeping peacefully on the couch. The staging was deliberate, careful, suggesting the killer wanted to create a specific tableau. Police investigation revealed no forced entry, no robbery, no sexual assault. Just Iris, killed by someone she'd apparently let into her home willingly. Someone she'd trusted enough to turn her back on. The lead detective was a man named Wesley Kane who'd worked dozens of homicides and had a reputation for methodical, thorough investigation. He was respectful when he interviewed me, understanding that I was both a grieving sister and a professional who understood exactly what questions he needed to ask. "Did Iris have any enemies?" he asked gently. "Anyone who'd threatened her or shown concerning behavior?" "No one I knew about," I said, my voice hollow with shock. "She was a teacher. She helped people. Who would want to hurt her?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Wesley said. The forensic evidence showed the killer had been careful. No fingerprints, no DNA under Iris's fingernails, no fibers that couldn't be explained by normal household contacts. Whoever killed my sister had either been extremely lucky or had known enough about forensic investigation to avoid leaving evidence. Given my profession, I immediately thought of someone with law enforcement training or knowledge. Someone who understood how investigations worked. The memorial service was held 6 days after Iris was found. Hundreds of people attended, students whose lives she'd touched, fellow teachers who'd worked alongside her, community members from the shelter where she volunteered. I stood greeting mourners, accepting condolences, and watching everyone carefully for signs of inappropriate behavior. Killers sometimes attended their victims' funerals, drawn by narcissistic need to witness the impact of their actions or by genuine complex emotions about the person they'd killed. I noted who seemed overly emotional, who seemed detached, who watched me rather than focusing on Iris's memory. Among the attendees was a man named Dexter Holloway who worked at the homeless shelter where Iris volunteered. He was in his early 30s, well-groomed and articulate, expressing sympathy with the appropriate level of emotion. He'd brought flowers and a card signed by shelter residents thanking Iris for her kindness. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said when he reached me in the receiving line. "Iris was a special person. She made everyone feel seen and valued." "Did you work closely with her at the shelter?" I asked, my professional instincts activating despite my grief. "Fairly closely," Dexter replied. "We coordinated volunteer schedules and sometimes ran programs together. She talked about you actually, about how you helped put criminals away. She was proud of your work." The mention of my profession felt slightly odd in this context, but grief made everything feel strange. I thanked him for coming and moved on to the next mourner. Over the following weeks, police investigation continued without significant progress. They interviewed Iris's colleagues, students' parents, shelter clients, Everyone in her life. No one stood out as obviously suspicious. No one had a clear motive or opportunity that aligned with the evidence. The case started going cold, which is what happens to most homicides when initial investigation doesn't produce strong leads. Wesley kept me updated out of professional courtesy, but I could see the frustration in his communications. "We're not giving up," he'd tell me. "But without new evidence or witnesses, we're limited in where we can take this investigation." I understood the reality of cold cases. I'd worked on dozens of them, helping interview suspects years after crimes were committed, analyzing behavioral patterns to identify likely perpetrators. But understanding the reality didn't make it less painful when it was my sister's murder sitting in a file box gathering dust. 6 months after Iris's death, I made a decision. I would conduct my own investigation using skills police didn't have. My forensic psychology training included deep expertise in criminal behavior, interview techniques, and psychological profiling. I could approach this differently than traditional law enforcement, focusing on psychological patterns rather than just physical evidence. I started by reviewing everything the police had gathered. Crime scene photos, autopsy reports, witness statements, forensic analysis. I studied it all with professional detachment, forcing myself to see Iris as a case rather than my sister. The staging bothered me most. Positioning her body to look peaceful, covering her with a blanket, arranging her hands. This suggested the killer had complex feelings about Iris, possibly guilt or affection mixed with whatever had motivated the murder. I built a psychological profile of the likely offender. Someone who knew Iris well enough to gain apartment access. Someone with impulse control issues that led to violence but also organizational skills that allowed for careful staging. Someone who felt both connection to and resentment of Iris. Someone whose self-image required them to transform a violent act into something that looked peaceful. The profile pointed toward someone in Iris's social circle who developed inappropriate attachment. I reviewed the list of people the police had interviewed, looking for anyone matching psychological markers. Dexter Holloway kept appearing in my analysis. He'd worked closely with Iris at the shelter. He'd known about my forensic psychology work, suggesting Iris had shared personal information with him. He'd attended the memorial service with appropriate but slightly performative grief. None of this was evidence. But psychologically, he fit the profile of someone who could have committed this crime. I started researching Dexter's background more thoroughly than the police had. Public records showed he'd moved to our city 3 years earlier from another state. Before that, his history was sparse, which was itself noteworthy. Most people leave extensive digital and paper trails through their 20s. Dexter's trail had significant gaps. I hired a private investigator to dig deeper. What she found was concerning. In his previous city, a woman Dexter had dated briefly had filed a restraining order against him after he'd shown up at her workplace repeatedly despite being told to stop. The order was later dropped when the woman moved away, but it suggested a pattern of obsessive behavior when romantic interest wasn't reciprocated. There was no evidence Dexter had been romantically interested in Iris, but obsessive attachment doesn't always manifest romantically. Sometimes it's about perceived friendship or connection that exists more intensely in the obsessed person's mind than in reality. I needed to interview Dexter myself, but I couldn't do so officially. I wasn't law enforcement, and approaching him directly would alert him to my suspicions. Instead, I volunteered at the homeless shelter where Iris and Dexter had worked together. I claimed I wanted to honor my sister's memory by continuing her volunteer work. The shelter director was touched by this gesture and welcomed me enthusiastically. My first shift overlapped with Dexter's schedule. He seemed surprised but pleased to see me. "Evelyn," he said warmly, "I didn't know you were volunteering here. It's wonderful that you're honoring Iris this way." "I wanted to feel connected to her work," I said truthfully. "She loved this place and these people." Over the next several weeks, I worked alongside Dexter multiple times. I observed his behavior carefully, noting his interactions with clients and other volunteers. He was charming and helpful, good at his job, well liked. He also watched me constantly. His attention focused more on me than on the work we were doing. When I'd mention Iris, he'd become slightly more animated, sharing memories and stories. Some of the stories were things Iris had told me about. Others were things I'd never heard, making me wonder if they were real memories or fabrications designed to demonstrate his closeness to her. 3 months into my volunteer work, I decided to test Dexter's psychological responses more directly. I invited him for coffee after a shift, framing it as wanting to talk to someone who'd known Iris well. He agreed eagerly. We met at a cafe near the shelter. I'd chosen the location carefully, a place with security cameras and enough ambient noise that recording our conversation wouldn't be obvious. I wore a small recording device disguised as a necklace, legal in our state for conversations you're participating in. We talked for nearly 2 hours. I asked about his memories of Iris, his thoughts about who might have wanted to hurt her, his own feelings about her death. Dexter was smooth and sympathetic, saying all the right things. But I noticed small tells. When I mentioned the crime scene staging, his eye contact faltered for a fraction of a second. When I described finding out about Iris's death, he showed slightly more interest in my emotional state than in Iris herself. When I mentioned that the police hadn't given up on finding her killer, he shifted in his seat almost imperceptibly. These weren't confession-level behaviors, but they were consistent with someone who had guilty knowledge trying to appear appropriately concerned. I knew I needed something more definitive, something that would trigger an involuntary response he couldn't control. That's when I started researching trauma responses and sensory memory. The human brain creates powerful associations between traumatic events and sensory details present during those events. Smells, sounds, tastes, any stimulus present during a traumatic experience can trigger involuntary physiological responses when encountered again. If Dexter had killed Iris, there would have been sensory details unique to that experience, details that would trigger autonomic responses his conscious control couldn't fully suppress. I reviewed the crime scene reports again, looking for sensory details that would have been significant during the murder itself. The autopsy showed Iris had consumed coffee shortly before death. Her apartment had a distinctive coffee maker, an expensive Italian brand that made very strong espresso. The smell would have been present in the apartment during the murder. Formed a plan. I would create a situation where Dexter would be exposed to that specific coffee smell unexpectedly, in a context where he wasn't prepared to control his response. If he'd been in Iris's apartment during or shortly after killing her, that smell would trigger a stress response, a micro-expression or physiological tell that would indicate guilty knowledge. The trap needed to be set carefully. It had to seem natural, not staged. It had to happen when I could observe his reactions clearly. For months after starting my volunteer work, I invited several shelter volunteers, including Dexter, to my apartment for a small gathering to mark the 1-year anniversary of Iris's death. I explained I wanted to share memories with people who'd known her and cared about her work. Everyone accepted, including Dexter. Before the gathering, I'd made specific preparations. I'd purchased the exact same Italian espresso maker Iris had owned. I'd acquired the same brand of coffee beans she'd used regularly. On the day of the gathering, I timed everything precisely. I wanted the coffee to be brewing when guests arrived, so the smell would hit them immediately upon entering. I also set up subtle recording equipment, cameras disguised as regular household items positioned to capture facial expressions and body language. When Dexter arrived, I greeted him at the door and ushered him inside. The coffee aroma was strong, filling the apartment exactly as it would have filled Iris's apartment. I watched his face carefully as he stepped inside. For just a moment, perhaps half a second, his expression changed. His eyes widened slightly. His nostrils flared. His jaw tightened. Then his face smoothed into a pleasant social smile as he greeted other guests. But I'd seen it. The involuntary response to a sensory trigger associated with traumatic memory. During the gathering, I made sure to maintain the coffee smell, brewing fresh pots throughout the evening. Each time Dexter was near the coffee maker, I observed subtle stress responses. Increased swallowing. Slight tension in his shoulders. momentary loss of his smooth social performance. None of this was evidence I could take to the police. But it confirmed my psychological analysis. Dexter had killed Iris, and he was carrying trauma responses associated with that act. After the gathering, I reviewed the video recordings carefully. The micro-expressions were clear when watched in slow motion and with professional understanding of stress indicators. Dexter was experiencing fear responses triggered by sensory memory of Iris's apartment. Now I needed to create conditions where he'd reveal this connection more explicitly, in ways that could support a criminal investigation. I scheduled another coffee meeting with Dexter, this time at a cafe that served the same Italian espresso Iris had used. I waited until he'd ordered and received his drink before casually mentioning something I'd claimed to remember. "I was thinking about Iris's apartment the other day," I said conversationally. "She had that fancy coffee maker. Do you remember that?" Dexter's hand tightened around his cup. "I don't think I was ever in her apartment," he said carefully. "We worked together at the shelter, but we weren't close friends who visited each other's homes." "Really?" I said, watching his face. "I could have sworn she mentioned you'd helped her move furniture once. She must have been talking about someone else." "Maybe," he said, his tone slightly defensive. "I helped a lot of people with various things. I might have forgotten." The denial was telling. If he genuinely hadn't been in Iris's apartment, he'd have simply agreed he hadn't been there. Instead, he hedged, leaving himself room to adjust his story if evidence contradicted his initial claim. This was behavior consistent with guilty knowledge. Over the next 2 months, I conducted several more informal interviews with Dexter, each time incorporating subtle sensory or contextual triggers while recording his responses. I built a compilation of micro-expressions, stress indicators, and verbal hedging that painted a psychological picture of someone carrying guilty knowledge about Iris's death. But psychological indicators weren't enough for criminal prosecution. I needed Dexter to make a mistake, to reveal knowledge he couldn't have unless he'd been present during or after the murder. I decided to use a technique called strategic interviewing, where you provide someone with false information to see how they respond. I met with Wesley Kane, the detective who'd investigated Iris's case. I explained what I'd been doing, my psychological analysis of Dexter, and the sensory response testing. Wesley was skeptical but interested. "What you're describing isn't admissible evidence," he said carefully. "Stress responses to coffee smells won't convince a jury. But if your analysis is correct, if Dexter did kill Iris, there might be a way to use your psychological insights to create an interview context where he reveals guilty knowledge." Wesley agreed to bring Dexter in for a follow-up interview, standard procedure in cold cases when investigators wanted to re-question witnesses with fresh perspective. The interview would be conducted by Wesley with me observing from behind one-way glass, providing real-time behavioral analysis. Before the interview, Wesley and I planned our strategy. We'd use a technique called the cognitive interview, designed to access detailed memories by having the subject reconstruct the entire context around specific events. For innocent people, this helps them remember forgotten details. For guilty people, it creates opportunities to contradict themselves or reveal knowledge they shouldn't have. The interview was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Dexter arrived believing this was routine follow-up on Iris's case, that police were re-interviewing everyone who'd known her. Wesley started with rapport building, thanking Dexter for coming in and acknowledging how difficult the anniversary of Iris's death must have been. Then he moved into the cognitive interview technique. "I'd like you to walk me through your last interactions with Iris," Wesley said. "Start from a week before her death. Tell me everything you remember, even small details that might not seem important." Dexter described volunteering shifts, brief conversations, nothing remarkable. His narrative was smooth, rehearsed sounding. When Wesley asked about the day Iris died, Dexter said he'd been home alone all day. No alibi, but no particular reason to need one since he hadn't known anything was wrong. Now, Wesley said, "I want you to think about Iris's apartment. Have you ever been there?" "I told Evelyn I wasn't," Dexter said, his guard going up. "We weren't that kind of friends." "So you've never seen inside her apartment," Wesley clarified. "Never been inside for any reason." I hesitated before answering, just a moment. From behind the glass I saw it. That micro-hesitation suggested he was considering what he could admit to versus what he needed to deny. No, he finally said. I've never been to her apartment. Wesley pulled out a photograph. Crime scene photo of Iris's living room showing her distinctive Italian coffee maker prominently on the kitchen counter. This is Iris's apartment, Wesley said casually. Does anything look familiar? Dexter looked at the photo, and I saw his eyes fix on the coffee maker for a fraction of a second before he forced himself to scan the rest of the image. Nothing looks familiar, he said. I've never been there. Wesley continued the interview, asking about the homeless shelter, about Iris's routine, about whether Dexter had noticed anyone paying inappropriate attention to her. Standard questions. But then he shifted. We found some interesting evidence we hadn't previously disclosed, Wesley said. This was the strategic lie we'd planned. DNA evidence that we're currently processing. It'll tell us who was in Iris's apartment around the time of her death. Dexter's physiological response was immediate and beyond his conscious control. His pupils dilated. His breathing rate increased. A thin sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. He was experiencing fear response to the possibility that DNA evidence existed linking him to the crime scene. We didn't actually have such evidence, but his reaction suggested he believed he might have left DNA despite his precautions. I don't understand why you're telling me this, Dexter said. His voice tight. Because we're telling everyone we interview, Wesley lied smoothly. Standard procedure to see if it jogs any memories about people who might have been in the apartment. The interview continued for another 30 minutes with Dexter becoming increasingly uncomfortable despite his attempts to maintain composure. Wesley had been trained in interview techniques, but he wasn't a forensic psychologist. When the interview ended and Dexter left, Wesley came to the observation room where I'd been watching. What did you see? He asked. Significant stress responses when you mentioned DNA evidence, I said. Respiratory changes, pupil dilation, perspiration. He's terrified that he left evidence despite being careful. That's consistent with guilty knowledge. Wesley nodded grimly. But it's still not enough for an arrest. We need more. I reviewed the interview recording multiple times, analyzing every micro-expression and physiological tell. Dexter had revealed guilty knowledge through his responses, but nothing explicit enough to support criminal charges. I needed to create one more situation where his trauma responses would be so significant that they'd constitute behavioral evidence, supplementing the circumstantial case. I designed what I called the coffee trap. I invited Dexter for another coffee meeting, this time at my office at the university where I taught forensic psychology part-time. I told him I wanted his perspective on something related to Iris's volunteer work. He agreed, probably curious about why I was still reaching out given the police interview. When Dexter arrived at my office, I had everything prepared. The room smelled strongly of the same Italian espresso from Iris's apartment. I'd placed a coffee cup on my desk, the same brand she'd used. I'd arranged crime scene photographs face down on my desk, visible edges suggesting their content without revealing details. Subtle environmental triggers designed to activate trauma memories. Thank you for coming, I said, gesturing for him to sit. I wanted to talk to you about memory. Dexter sat, his eyes flickering to the photographs, the coffee, the smell filling the room. What about memory? He asked warily. I'm researching how traumatic events create sensory associations, I explained, watching his face carefully. How smells or sights can trigger involuntary memories of significant experiences. For example, certain coffee aromas might remind someone of a specific place or event. I picked up my coffee cup, the smell intensifying as I moved it. Like this particular Italian espresso. It's very distinctive. Do you find certain smells trigger memories for you? I saw his struggle to control his response. His hands gripped the chair arms. His breathing became shallow. His eyes fixed on the coffee cup with something approaching panic. I don't think so, he managed to say, but his voice was strained. Everyone has sensory memory associations, I continued relentlessly. They're involuntary. The brain creates these connections during emotionally significant events. Someone who'd experienced trauma in a place that smelled like this coffee, for instance, would have automatic stress responses when encountering that smell again. No amount of conscious control could fully suppress those responses. Dexter stood abruptly. "I don't feel well," he said. "I need to leave." Before he could reach the door, I said something that stopped him. "The thing about guilty knowledge, Dexter, is that it leaves psychological scars that manifest in predictable ways." Someone who'd been in Iris's apartment during a traumatic event would show specific stress responses to sensory triggers associated with that experience. Responses exactly like the ones you've been showing for months. He turned, his face pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," I said calmly. "You killed my sister. You strangled her in her apartment where that coffee smell was everywhere. You've been carrying trauma from that act. And every time you encounter that specific sensory trigger, your autonomic nervous system responds with fear. You can't control it because trauma responses bypass conscious regulation." The accusation hung in the air. Dexter's face went through multiple expressions: denial, calculation, fear, before settling on cold anger. "You can't prove anything," he said. "Psychological theories aren't evidence." "You're right," I agreed. "Which is why I've spent the past 6 months building a behavioral case showing your guilty knowledge through documented responses to controlled stimuli. And why Wesley Kane has been conducting parallel investigation based on the profile I developed. You think you were careful, Dexter. But you left something at the scene. Not physical evidence. Psychological evidence. Your trauma responses to reminders of what you did." Dexter's hands were shaking now, his carefully controlled facade crumbling under the weight of psychological pressure. "I cared about Iris," he said, his voice breaking. "She was special. She understood me in ways other people didn't. But she started pulling away, becoming distant. When I went to her apartment that night to talk to her, to make her understand how much our connection meant, she told me I was making her uncomfortable. That we weren't as close as I thought. She rejected me." The confession was tumbling out now, his need to justify overwhelming his self-preservation. "I didn't mean to hurt her. Just happened." My hands were around her neck before I realized what I was doing. And then it was too late. She was gone. I recorded everything. The small device I'd worn to every meeting with Dexter was capturing his confession. "Why did you stage her like that?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the rage burning through me. "Making her look peaceful." "Because I loved her," Dexter said, tears streaming down his face now. "I couldn't leave her looking like she'd suffered. I wanted her to look like she was sleeping, like she was at peace. I wanted to remember her that way, not as someone I'd hurt." The confession continued for another 10 minutes as Dexter described details only the killer would know. How he'd cleaned the apartment to remove evidence. How he'd used gloves throughout. How he'd left through the back door to avoid being seen by neighbors. All of it recorded. All of it admissible because he'd voluntarily confessed to me in my office. When he finally stopped talking, I stood and opened my office door. Wesley Kane was waiting in the hallway with 2 other detectives, having listened to everything through the audio feed from my recording device. "Dexter Holloway," Wesley said, stepping into the office, "you're under arrest for the murder of Iris Trent." Dexter didn't resist. He looked at me with something between resentment and relief. "You manipulated me," he said. "Used psychological tactics to make me confess." "I used your own trauma responses against you," I corrected. "You killed my sister and thought you'd gotten away with it. But guilty knowledge creates psychological scars you couldn't hide. You revealed yourself every time you reacted to sensory triggers associated with your crime." The trial took place 8 months later. The prosecution built their case on Dexter's recorded confession combined with behavioral analysis, showing his trauma responses to sensory triggers. I testified for 2 days about forensic psychology, trauma memory, and the specific techniques I'd used to identify and confirm Dexter's guilty knowledge. The defense argued that I'd manipulated a vulnerable person into a false confession, that my psychological tactics were coercive. But the jury heard Dexter's own words describing details only the killer could know. They saw the video recordings of his involuntary stress responses to coffee smells and environmental triggers. They understood that someone innocent wouldn't show such consistent patterns of guilty knowledge. Dexter was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years to life. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged that while the investigation methods were unconventional, they'd ultimately served justice by identifying a killer who'd evaded traditional investigation. After the conviction, I received criticism from some colleagues who felt my methods had crossed ethical boundaries. Using psychological manipulation on someone outside a formal law enforcement context raised questions about consent and professional responsibility. I understood their concerns, but I didn't regret my actions. Dexter had killed my sister and would have remained free if I hadn't used my expertise to identify and expose him. I also received support from many forensic psychologists who recognized that my methods, while unconventional, had been grounded in legitimate psychological principles. Trauma responses to sensory triggers are well documented. Using controlled stimuli to elicit those responses is ethically complex but not inherently wrong when the goal is identifying a killer. The case became a teaching example in forensic psychology programs about the intersection of professional expertise and personal involvement. Could a forensic psychologist conduct an effective investigation when emotionally connected to the victim? Should they? The debate continued long after Dexter's conviction. For me, the answer was clear. My emotional connection to Iris had motivated me to pursue justice, but my professional training had provided the tools to achieve it. Without both elements, personal motivation and professional expertise, Dexter would never have been caught. 2 years after Dexter's conviction, I published a paper about the case in a forensic psychology journal. The paper detailed the methodology I'd used, the theoretical foundation for trauma trigger testing, and the ethical considerations around conducting psychological investigation outside formal law enforcement contexts. The paper sparked significant discussion in the field. Some researchers saw potential for new investigative techniques. Others worried about psychological manipulation being used without proper oversight. Everyone agreed the case raised important questions about where professional boundaries existed when personal stakes were involved. I also worked with Wesley Kane and the District Attorney's Office to develop training programs for law enforcement on incorporating forensic psychology more effectively into cold case investigations. My experience with Iris's case demonstrated that behavioral analysis and psychological profiling could provide investigative avenues when physical evidence was limited. 3 years after Iris's death, I started a victim advocacy organization focused specifically on supporting families of murder victims whose cases had gone cold. The organization provided resources for families who wanted to pursue private investigation while respecting law enforcement boundaries. We trained advocates in basic forensic psychology principles, helping them understand behavioral patterns that might identify likely suspects. The organization also connected families with forensic psychologists willing to consult on cold cases, providing professional expertise that many families couldn't otherwise afford. Over 5 years, we helped generate new leads in over 30 cold cases, with 6 cases resulting in arrests based partially on psychological profiling and behavioral analysis. 4 years after Dexter's conviction, I received a letter from him. It came from the maximum security prison where he was serving his sentence. The letter was 8 pages, single-spaced, describing his mental state and his reflections on what had happened. Dr. Trent, the letter began, "I've spent 4 years thinking about how you caught me. Not just the confession but the months before that when you were testing me without my knowledge. Using coffee smells and environmental triggers to make me reveal guilty responses. It was brilliant and ruthless. You used your understanding of trauma psychology as a weapon against me." The letter continued describing his realization that from our first coffee meeting, I'd been studying him, building a behavioral case while appearing to simply grieve with someone who'd known Iris. He felt betrayed that I'd manipulated him under the guise of friendship. I destroyed the letter after reading it once. Dexter wanted to maintain some connection, to continue engaging with me intellectually even from prison. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. He'd taken my sister from me. I'd used my professional expertise to ensure he faced consequences. We were done. 5 years after Iris's death, I was invited to present at an international forensic psychology conference about innovative investigative techniques. I spoke about the coffee trap, the methodology behind trauma trigger testing, and the ethical frameworks that should guide such work. The presentation was controversial but well received. Afterward, a detective from another state approached me about consulting on a cold case where they suspected someone in the victim's social circle but lacked evidence. Would I be willing to conduct behavioral analysis, she asked. I agreed, recognizing that my experience with Iris's case had given me unique expertise in this specific type of investigation. Over the next several years, I consulted on multiple cold cases, using forensic psychology to identify likely suspects and develop strategies for eliciting guilty knowledge. Not all cases ended with confessions or convictions, but my work generated new leads in most of them, advancing investigations that had been stalled for years. Today, at 37 years old, I continue working as a forensic psychologist, teaching, consulting with law enforcement, and running the victim advocacy organization. Iris's murder and my pursuit of her killer fundamentally changed my career trajectory, transforming me from academic psychologist to someone who actively applies forensic psychology in real-world investigations. The coffee trap that exposed Dexter became a teaching case about how sensory memory creates involuntary responses that can reveal guilty knowledge. But more than technique, it became a story about how grief can be channeled into methodical pursuit of justice, how professional expertise can serve personal missions, and how sometimes the best revenge is using your knowledge to ensure someone who thinks they're untouchable discovers they left psychological fingerprints they never knew existed. If this story showed you that killers who think they've covered their tracks forget that guilt leaves psychological scars that can't be hidden from someone trained to see them, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about forensic psychology, methodical justice, and using expertise as both tool and weapon. Drop a comment about whether you think family members should be able to investigate their loved ones' murders using professional skills. Because sometimes justice requires patience, precision, and understanding that the human brain reveals truth through involuntary responses no amount of conscious control can fully suppress.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoy watching Karma, Payback, come full circle every week, we dive into tales of betrayal and poetic justice. Don't miss the next one. Tap the subscribe button and join the Revenge Squad.